Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jacqueline Lopour on the subject of Yemen. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm a Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation and an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance or international public policy here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Jacqueline Lopour. She is a research associate here at CIGI and a former political analyst with the CIA. And she's just written a policy brief on the looming crisis, or the current crisis, taking place in Yemen. Jacqueline, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
For the benefit of our audience who may not be familiar with the situation, what is currently happening in Yemen?
The bottom line is that Yemen is facing arguably the world's worst humanitarian crisis on the globe. Yemen is starting its second year of a civil war, and the problem is that the international community is not paying attention to this war. People don't even know about it. When it does get media attention, it's often referred to as the forgotten war. The reason this is so significant is that Yemen has 21 million people in need of humanitarian aid, and this puts it in a unique position to be the source of the world's next major refugee crisis. We're already looking at between estimates 4 to 7 million Syrian refugees flooding in the gates of Europe. Adding refugees from Yemen, which in case the international community doesn't do anything, is basically poised to just break those floodgates open.
So could you say a little bit more about the roots of the civil conflict and who's involved?
Absolutely. There's a complex array of actors, and first it should be noticed that Yemen, even before the civil wars, had years of instability and unrest, both political and violent, which have caused a lot of these problems. The civil war actually goes back to about 2004, when an insurgent group called the Houthis started waging a low-level insurgency against the Yemeni government. Flash forward to early 2015, this movement had gained steam, and these insurgents actually succeeded in overrunning the capital of Sana'a and ousting the Hadi government. President Hadi is basically the internationally recognized president of Yemen.
Right.
In March 2015, that's when most people consider the civil war to have started. That is when Saudi Arabia came to the defense of its allies, the government, the internationally recognized government of Yemen, and started an intense bombing campaign. And it is this bombing campaign that has caused so much destruction and so much loss of life in Yemen. The campaign has waged on now for almost a year. And on one side, you have the internationally recognized government of Yemen with President Hadi, Saudi Arabia, a coalition of GCC and Arab Sunni allies, also supported by the United States and the United Kingdom. On the other side, you have the Houthi insurgents who have the backing of Iran. So what you also have going on here is a quasi-proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right. Now, the international community has taken some steps to address the conflict. The Security Council of the United Nations, for instance, has just issued a recent report on the situation. Can you say a little bit about how the UN Security Council views the conflict?
Absolutely. The UN Security Council actually stepped into the conflict quite in the beginning in support of the internationally recognized government of Yemen. From now on, I'll just refer to it as the Hadi government. They issued sanctions against the Houthis and Houthi supporters, which actually included a former president of Yemen that had been ousted as part of the Arab Spring Rebellion. What has happened as a part of this report is that the international aid organizations started expressing quite a lot of concern about the conduct of the war. They were noticing that there were a lot of civilian casualties as a result of this Saudi-led coalition bombing campaign. They were noticing that the humanitarian crisis was ratcheting up. You were having reports of hospitals being bombed, of deliberate starvation of civilians. So recently, the Security Council had a panel of experts write up a report about the situation in Yemen. It dealt with the effectiveness of sanctions, among other things, but one of the most disturbing parts of this report was how it dealt with the humanitarian situation. And it talked about how both sides, both the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition and the Yemeni government were engaging in conduct that were violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. And this is everything from the deliberate starvation of civilians in Taiz by the Houthis. They had a siege of the city of Taiz, which was Yemen's second biggest city, which was hundreds of thousands of people being deliberately denied food or water. From the Saudi angle, where there was bombings that deliberately targeted houses, neighborhoods, mosques, markets, aid depots, trucks with food. You've seen the old city of Sana'a, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, completely leveled by this bombing campaign.
Right. And so are there other things that the UN can be doing or the international community can be doing to essentially try to either contain the conflict or even ideally bring some kind of resolution to it?
Absolutely. I would say there's three things that need to happen. One is international attention. Yes, the UN Security Council and UN aid organizations and international aid organizations are concerned about it. But right now, there really hasn't been quite the media attention or even public policy attention on the conflict of Yemen in the rest of the world. Everybody's focused on Syria. So first you need to raise awareness of what's going on and raise awareness of how severe this catastrophe is and how millions of people are going to basically starve to death unless something happens. On that vein, the next thing is that OCHA has put out a call for funding to support humanitarian aid, and they've asked for $1.8 billion. Aid organizations in Yemen are severely underfunded. Last year, they did not even get half of what they requested. To put it into context, the United States alone could have funded almost all of the UN's aid requirement if they had given to Yemen only what they gave to Syria last year. So severely underfunded. So with attention comes a concerted effort from donors to actually provide aid so that they can actually start providing some of the services so desperately needed. And the last is intensified international support for peace talks. The first round of peace talks were held in December, and they were actually quite constructive. They brought the Houthis to the table. They brought the Hadi-led government to the table. They were able to work out a temporary cessation of hostilities, some aid coordination going on, prisoner transfers, but that was just the first step. And the second step that needs to happen is a continuation of these talks. And as part of that, what we really need to see is Saudi Arabia and Iran basically getting behind these peace talks and stop using Yemen as another proxy war. We saw repeated delays in scheduling the next round of peace talks right after Saudi Arabia and Iran got into their quarrel earlier this year when Saudi Arabia executed the Shia cleric. Right. So really what we need is international pressure also on Saudi Arabia and Iran to support these peace talks so that we could see the Yemeni people be able to have a peaceful situation where they can rebuild their lives.
Right. Well, and maybe we could shift and focus a bit on Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. As you know, Saudi Arabia is a major purchaser of arms from the UK, the US, and here in Canada. And of course, we've had the recent announcement or the recent contract for $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles. Now, very, very recently, the Globe and Mail has reported that there's evidence that these light armored vehicles are being used in the conflict and against civilians. What is the West's role in this conflict? And either as a constructive player or perhaps part of the problem?
So far, most Western governments have formally thrown their support behind Saudi Arabia and the Hadi-led government. That has, both in Canada, the UK, and the US have billions and billions of dollars of arms sales. The question of whether or not that support is going to continue is really a question of political will. There's been a lot of domestic criticism of this in most Western countries. But what that also provides is an opportunity. This is not an all or nothing situation. It's not either support Saudi Arabia or pull back the contracts. This is a point of leverage. Right now, Saudi Arabia their airstrikes are causing intensive damage to civilian structures and many, many civilian casualties. This is a point of leverage that we could use to go to the Saudi government and say, you need to improve this. We need an impartial, independent panel that looks at this destruction, and they need to do better at protecting civilian lives. That is their obligation under international humanitarian law. And these arm deals are very lucrative and very important for them. That provides a very, very, very powerful point of leverage. But we also need the political will to use that.
Right. And what about Iran? I mean, it's been a big year for Iran, first with the nuclear deal and now with the lifting of sanctions. Do you see those same opportunities for the West to push them on being more constructive in Yemen?
Absolutely. Iran has expressed so much optimism about the opportunity to bring itself into the international economy and expand business opportunities. So this, again, provides extreme leverage to push Iran to also play a very constructive role in this conflict. Right now, you see a war of words between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a war of rhetoric in that each are blaming each other for destabilizing the region. So this also is an opportunity to push Iran to say, you need to work constructively for peace. Stop arming the Houthis, stop providing the military support, push all sides to come to the table and hammer out an agreement that provides all sides with what they want, whether it's political representation in a new government for the Houthis or some sort of economic aid package that helps any new unit government get off the ground.
Are you optimistic that a political solution to the situation in Yemen is possible in the near future, or is this going to become another protracted conflict?
I think if it doesn't have the inattention by the international community and the support, it could be a protracted conflict. That being said, there is a lot of precedent in Yemen for coming to the table and hashing out deals. Yemen experienced incredible unrest in the wake of Arab Spring, and everybody was able to come to the table and work to have a somewhat peaceful transfer of power from the former president to the current president. Yemen has had multiple civil wars in its past, and most of them did not, well, one of them went for about 9 years, but most of them were actually resolved relatively peacefully within a matter of months. So there is precedent in Yemen for this constructive dialogue. And if the international community is able to get behind it and support it and give this conflict the attention it needs, then I am optimistic.
Great. Thank you so much for being on the show, Jacqueline. This was absolutely fascinating. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Please join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cigionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jacqueline Lopour on the subject of Yemen. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm a Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation and an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance or international public policy here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Jacqueline Lopour. She's a research associate here at CIGI and a former political analyst with the CIA. And she's just written a policy brief on the looming crisis, or the current crisis, taking place in Yemen. Jacqueline, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
For the benefit of our audience who may not be familiar with the situation, what is currently happening in Yemen?
The bottom line is that Yemen is facing arguably the world's worst humanitarian crisis on the globe. Yemen is starting its second year of a civil war, and the problem is that the international community is not paying attention to this war. People don't even know about it. When it does get media attention, it's often referred to as the forgotten war. The reason this is so significant is that Yemen has 21 million people in need of humanitarian aid, and this puts it in a unique position to be the source of the world's next major refugee crisis. We're already looking at between estimates 4 to 7 million Syrian refugees flooding in the gates of Europe. adding refugees from Yemen, which in case the international community doesn't do anything, is basically poised to just break those floodgates open.
So could you say a little bit more about the roots of the civil conflict